You're listening to the Bloomberg Opinion Podcast. Catch us Saturdays at 1 and 7 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app, or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Amy Morris. This week, it's a matter of trust. Trust in science and in scientists. We'll talk with Bloomberg's Faye Flam. And we'll explore the erosion of trust in politics and our country's institutions and where that might lead the country in an alarmingly short time. But we begin with Taylor Swift and her Eras tour that took her through Brazil.
Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye. You were bigger than the whole sky. You were more than just a short time.
The Grammy winner returned to the stage in Rio de Janeiro. Here she is performing Bigger Than the Whole Sky. It's one of her surprise songs in that tour. It happened a day after she had to postpone her Eras tour because of the extreme temperatures at the time. This also appeared to be something of a tribute to a fan who died, reportedly in connection with that triple-digit heat. The heat index reached 59.7 degrees Celsius at one point. That's nearly 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's talk about this with Bloomberg Opinion columnist Lara Williams. She covers climate change. Lara, those temperatures are insane. I had to double check those numbers.
Yeah, they're mad. They're importantly, so that's the heat index. So it combines the actual heat, which was around 40 degrees Celsius, 102 Fahrenheit, with the humidity. And that's what really was making the temperatures so dangerous, because the heat-humidity combination can be really, really bad.
And a fan actually passed away. Swift had trouble breathing. The tour had to be postponed. And as you point out in your column, this is not the first performance to be impacted by the effects of climate change.
No. So Billboard has been keeping tally of major concerts around the world that have been impacted by extreme weather. And I think the count, not including the Taylor concerts, actually was above 30, and so that's evacuations, cancellations, postponements, and it's everything from people being directly impacted by extreme rain, extreme heat, to Pearl Jam had to cancel 3 concerts because their lead singer got throat damage from performing in an outdoor concert in Paris, and got affected by the heat and dust and wildlife smoke. So there are all these kind of knock-on effects from climate change that aren't even direct. It can be indirect as well. And
you say at least 30 performances, and that's just this year?
Just this year, and that's just major ones that Billboard have picked up. So I'm sure there's been plenty of smaller gigs and, up-and-coming musicians that have been affected too.
I completely forgot about the wildfires, too. That's crazy. So would this then help drive the message of climate change home, or is anyone listening? Are people just annoyed that their favorite show is being postponed?
I'm sure lots of people were annoyed that their favorite show was being postponed. I know some people didn't make it. Saturday night got postponed to Monday, and some people weren't going to be in Rio on Monday. So that was annoying for them. But I think kind of longer term, it really makes the point that we need to be able to adapt and have plans in place so that, concerts can go on without causing danger to life. Disasters happen when these extreme events hit pre-existing vulnerabilities. And the important thing is at the Taylor concert, probably the gig shouldn't have gone ahead. But also fans weren't allowed to bring their own personal water bottles into the show. There was reports of inadequate distribution of the free water. Fans complained that it was too crowded. And so those things together really combined, and potentially led to the death of one fan.
We are talking with Bloomberg Opinion columnist Lara Williams about how climate change is impacting live tours and performances and shows. And you were talking about the adaptation that we're all going to have to see. And we're specifically targeting, of course, these live shows and these tours and these concerts in this particular interview. Venues are going to have to change those rules. Like you said, allowing people to bring in their own water bottles, maybe even putting a disclaimer on the ticket about a climate change impact type of thing where you may or may not be allowed to get your money back or trade in your ticket for something else, that kind of thing. Are we going to see more of that? Are you hearing any chatter or any hubbub about changing how the venues are able to do business based on the impact of climate change? And even as I say that, that sounds really remarkable.
Yeah, I think I've not heard anything specific to the music industry, but I think, people are starting to pay attention, and adaptation has been one of those forgotten, aspects of the kind of climate era. Historically, adaptation was almost looked down upon because people saw it as a controversial thing that was taking money and attention away from the, we need to reduce emissions, which is obviously still, really important, but we need to remember that climate impacts are already here. And so we need to be able to adapt. And so, you'd hope that stuff like this and high profile events being affected does make, venues pay attention and start putting together proper heat, and governments as well. This obviously has to come from governments. Governments are also not very good at planning for, the physical risks of climate change, and neither are companies. So I think the more we talk about it, the more people are going to start building this into their kind of operations and, into laws. The Brazilian government actually reacted with emergency rules, to ensure that venues have to provide water and have to allow personal water bottles into venues. So, it's a shame that it took such a tragedy to kind of spark that. But to be fair, Brazil did respond very quickly over the weekend.
Have we seen this before? Is this quite unusual?
That's a good question. I mean, we've seen lots, as the Billboard list shows, that, we've seen lots of, climate impacts. Burning Man, they all got reined in.
Sure.
This year.
Let me just clarify. That's for this year, and they've started doing a tally for this year. But we haven't seen tallies for years before, have we? I mean, the idea that concerts and venues are having to change how they do business because of the impact of climate change seems really fresh and new.
Yes, that's a good point. We haven't been paying attention to this before, and so in that way, and to be fair, we've seen the physical risks of climate change really come to the fore in the last couple of years. We're now in an El Nino year, which is raising global temperatures and potentially exacerbating the heat risk and extreme weather risks. And I think, it's new that people are paying so much attention to adaptation.
Can we expect to see more of this then? Not just with concerts and live entertainment, but other organizations, companies, venues having to adapt?
Yes, exactly. For the S&P Global Corporate Sustainability Assessment is a kind of survey of thousands of companies around the world, and only 1 in 5 companies have an adaptation plan to adapt their supply chains and operations to the physical risks of climate change. And so we'll probably see a lot more companies. There's basically a lot of companies need to catch up to the current climate and current climate change risks, and so we'll probably see that happen in the next year or so.
On the flip side of this coin, it's actually quite true. Swifties are really a force of their own. If they can't recruit more Gen Zers to the climate change fight, if not Taylor Swift, then who? I mean, it seems like this is, while it's an awful tragedy and it's a very difficult thing to face, at the same time, enormous amounts of attention are being paid to it now.
Yes, no, exactly. I think one thing that could make it even more impactful is if, Taylor herself would talk about climate change. And, obviously, it's very early on. She's in the middle of a global tour. I'm sure the events on Friday and, over the weekend have really affected her personally. And so I'm not surprised that we haven't heard her speak out about it yet. But if Swifties and, Taylor Swift could talk about climate change and raise awareness, then that could be really powerful.
It almost seems like an opportunity for like a Live Aid, a Band-Aid, some sort of concert or gathering to help raise awareness for the issue.
Yeah, for sure. I think I have heard that, people involved with Live Aid did want to do a climate one. And I think last year Billie Eilish, I think there was a big festival in maybe Paris, or somewhere like that for, to raise money and awareness about climate change. But we can't, yeah, we're just that momentum needs to continue. We need to keep the momentum going. And so hopefully, you know, something good will come out of this, and that's more awareness about the need for adaptation plans, and also more awareness among Gen Z about climate change and the very real risks that climate change poses, not only to people in abstract time periods and countries, but to their enjoyment of their own lives, really.
Lara, thank you for taking the time with us on this today.
Thank you for having me.
Bloomberg Opinion columnist Lara Williams covers climate change. And coming up, science and trust in scientists is taking a hit in the United States. You're listening to Bloomberg Opinion.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Opinion Podcast. Catch us Saturdays at 1 and 7 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app, or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Amy Morris. Science and trust in scientists is taking a hit in the United States. A new Pew Research Center poll finds that Americans' trust in scientists continues to decline. Among both Democrats and Republicans, trust in scientists is now lower than it was before the pandemic. Similarly, the positive views of science and belief in its positive effect on society continues to dip. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. During the pandemic in Texas, pediatrician Christina Probst made an appeal to the public to continue to take precautions to avoid getting and spreading COVID, even after the state reopened businesses and lifted mask mandates.
We are doing our part. And so it is really a painful experience to feel that our elected officials don't trust us, don't trust our expertise, and are not listening to the science.
But this is not all about the pandemic necessarily. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Faye Flam joins me now. Faye covers science and is host of the Follow the Science podcast. Faye, where's this coming from, this distrust of science and scientists?
Well, I think that there is a connection with the pandemic. The Pew Research Foundation just came up with some new numbers where the public trust in science did take quite a dip from 2019 to now. And what else seems likely to have changed? We've had this pandemic, we've had scientists telling people what to think and what to do. And I don't think it has anything to do with astronomers or physicists or other scientists. I think it has to do with medical science primarily and public health and some of the missteps that public health made during the pandemic.
But this also crosses party lines, which is not something we saw during the pandemic. In fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah, I think maybe over time it does. Republicans are less likely to trust scientists than Democrats. But I think overall there have been some flaws in the way the pandemic was handled that the general public is more likely to be concerned about right now.
Is this also a reflection of the muddying of the message during the Trump administration, which was a very intentional thing? Or is there something else happening that has caused the public to continue to distrust science? Is this a lingering after effect, or is there more to it?
I think there is more to it. In fact, one of the things I'm going to be writing about in this column is a book that I really like. It's called Within Reason, and it's written by Sandro Gallia, who's Dean of Public Health at Boston University. And this book is just a really nice sort of honest reckoning with what public health got wrong during the pandemic and why they got it wrong. And I had a very nice talk with him. And I think he has the humility to recognize that this might not be completely something wrong with the public. It might also be something wrong with the way scientists handled things. I think that there have been a few editorials by scientists saying, well, we've got to fix the general public so they trust us again. But I think that there is a real place for self-reflection. And I think one of the things that went wrong during the pandemic was what I call false certainty. And, when people were saying things when they didn't really know and would say, no, we definitely know you should do this or do that. And now, in retrospect, when they got things wrong, they said, we didn't know. But then my question to them is, well, if you didn't know, why didn't you just say you didn't know? And I saw that happen early in the pandemic. It wasn't just a flip-flop on masks. There was a flip-flop on how to think about the pandemic. So in January and February, there was actually a lot of evidence building up that the problem in China was incredibly disruptive, and that the disease was spreading, and that we could face a real problem. But I was seeing editorials running in the paper saying seasonal flu is a bigger threat. Don't worry about this. And there should have been a huge effort at that time to prepare hospitals, to get PPE for all of the workers, to prepare the general public for a possible disruption, to give businesses and private citizens time to prepare for these lockdowns. But instead, even though the science didn't make a U-turn, the evidence was building up, but the scientists did take a big U-turn, from don't worry to stay in your house. Right. And yes, some of the restrictions they made also were counter to what scientific evidence was building up, that there was already fairly early on an understanding that outdoors was safer than indoors. And yet we saw, playgrounds being taped up, and people, police chasing people out of parks, and skateboard parks being filled in with sand, stuff that was not following the science.
And we are talking with Bloomberg Opinion columnist Faye Flam about this new poll regarding trust in science and why that trust is waning. On a general level, Faye, is trust in short supply across the board in the United States anyway? Just not in science, but everywhere.
It is. In fact, scientists were still more trusted than almost everybody else, including journalists. So what people really need isn't trust in individual scientists, but trust in the process of science and the methods of science. Things like clinical trials, double-blind clinical trials, are actually designed as sort of an antidote to human fallibility and human bias. And the reason that science produces reliable knowledge for us all is the methods of science and the way this sort of group project of science keeps adding to that knowledge. But individual scientists are fallible, and it's very hard to, if we do develop trust in science, then or trust in individual scientists, how do people know which scientists are the right scientists? There are plenty of people that are considered outliers and even hucksters who have PhDs and MDs behind their name. And so there's also a problem with fringe scientists. So I think understanding, trust in the big picture science can help people recognize when scientists who are trustworthy will point to the wider body of knowledge that is science, not try to say, oh, all of those scientists, everybody else is wrong, I'm right. That's a red flag.
So then the onus would be on the general public, right? To know the difference between science and pseudoscience and just outright fraud?
Yeah, but they do know that you should come with evidence,
Sure.
That if you're a scientist, you better have some really strong evidence, and that there is a sort of connection between things we know, things that we've built up, knowledge we've known from the past. It's why those vaccines worked so as well as they did, because they were built on years of biological experiments. And then they also had to go through clinical trials that were designed to flag problems and make sure that they really worked the way they thought they worked.
This isn't just distrust of scientists, though. This poll also shows that Americans are questioning the positive role that science has on society. Did that surprise you?
A little bit, yeah, because that seems like we're surrounded by so many things that are made possible by our advancing scientific knowledge. But I think the pandemic may have left people so bitter that they may be reacting to that. Polls sometimes it's hard to know without more detail where that's coming from.
What can the scientific community do to win people back? It almost sounds like they need a PR campaign, but that just seems wrong.
I think that one of the things I really liked about this book, Within Reason, was the idea that science has to sort of rise above all of the politics and has to be self-reflective, has to be honest about where they might have gotten things wrong and where some of the policies during the pandemic weren't completely science-based. And that with that kind of reckoning and radical honesty, that is where trust, I think, can be re-earned.
Thank you, Faye. Faye Flam is a Bloomberg Opinion columnist who covers science and is host of the Follow the Science podcast. Coming up, trust in politics. It's not a pipe dream. There is a measure of trust in our political system that is eroding to a perilous end. This is Bloomberg Opinion.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Opinion podcast. Catch us Saturdays at 1 and 7 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app, or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Amy Morris. There is a difference between the 2024 election season and the election of 2016. Now, 8 years ago, the race for the White House was won by a candidate who had categorized himself as an outsider, a businessman, someone different who would serve as a disruptor. But this election season, voters know who Donald Trump is, and he's promising to build camps for migrants, purge the vermin from obstructing his endgame. He has praise for dictators, all while he's facing numerous indictments and legal entanglements that don't seem to slow him down at all. And the disconnect here might very well be a matter of trust. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Clive Crook is a member of the editorial board covering economics, and he joins me now. And Clive, you have this really great column on the Bloomberg Terminal. Your view is that Donald Trump could never really have gotten this far, actually without Democrats' unwitting assistance, in part because of their refusal to recognize the collapsing trust in this country. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that thesis, made sense actually first time around, when Trump was first elected. I think, just as you say, he campaigned as an outsider, as something of a wrecker, someone who wouldn't bow down to the rules, but would just, fix what needed fixing. And the fact that he succeeded before, shows that people didn't really trust politics as usual. So I think that factor was already in play. But this time around, I think it's vastly more serious. I mean, to be honest with you, I wasn't that worried about Trump first time around. Perhaps I should have been, but I wasn't. I thought he'd be tamed by the system, controlled somewhat by the system. And I think to a large degree he was. But I think it would be a big mistake to suppose he won't be any more dangerous next time. I think he's out for revenge for the way he's been treated by the system. And the astonishing fact is that he commands very wide support in the country. And the people who are telling pollsters that they're for Trump, having seen what's happened and having listened to what he said lately, they're basically expressing a complete lack of confidence in the system as usual. So I think, as it were, going into another Trump administration, it would be a much more destabilizing, much more dangerous prospect than it was last time around. And that is saying something.
Do you believe that the electorate from the beginning didn't really have a lot of healthy trust in the system, and that's how Donald Trump was able to make those gains in 2015 and 2016. He was able to capitalize on that, and now it has turned into its own. It's taken on a life of its own, if you will.
Yeah, well, I think there were sort of compounding factors in 2016, and in my view, Hillary Clinton was one. She basically expressed disdain for a good part of the population. In that campaign, you remember, the notorious remark about deplorables. Mm-hmm. That was really like an instruction to people that told them, she has no interest in their views, and, they can get lost. I mean, what an extraordinary position for a politician seeking election to take. So I think that was, as it were, a compounding factor last time. But, as I say, this time it's going to be much worse because we've seen so many dimensions of trust break down more radically than before. I mean, I can, one thinks of several examples. I mean, Biden and his officials are refusing to listen and take seriously people's complaints about what's happened to prices. The Biden administration's position is Bidenomics is a work of genius. We're transforming the economy. And people who are worried about high prices and what's happened to their real incomes are just failing to understand the statistics. And if only they would listen to the experts, their concerns would go away. Well, this is nonsense. I mean, many people are in a state of genuine financial insecurity. The averages on this are very misleading. You've got to look at people who are struggling because of this spike in prices. And the Biden administration has basically said, we're not interested. This is misinformation, so we're not going to address it. I want to think of other dimensions of this. I mean, trust in experts has fallen because of what happened during the pandemic. The school closures, all the back and forth over whether you need masks, whether they work, whether they're essential, all that, I think, sort of eroded trust. And now we have this extraordinary sort of weaponization of the justice system to put Trump in jail by any means necessary. Now, I do think Trump, I should make clear, I mean, Trump scares me. I mean, I do think he has authoritarian appetites. And it dismays me that, the prospect that he could win an election just both amazes me and dismays me. But look at it from the point of view of his supporters. What they see is politically active prosecutors going after him from all these different directions. Unfortunately, the US has a highly politicized criminal justice system. The prosecutors, in many cases, are political actors with political ambitions. And so they can't take it for granted that people will assume that what they're doing is in the public interest. They're always under suspicion of advancing a political agenda. Now, have they restrained themselves, given that that is the case? I would say no, they have not. Quite the opposite. They're doubling down. What it's done is it's told people we were right not to trust the criminal justice system. And that is a terrifying thing that I think we're seeing now.
We are talking with Bloomberg Opinion columnist Clive Crook about the degradation of trust in the United States in politics, government, institutions, and where that might lead us. How did we get here, Clive?
Well, it's the key question. And I do hold Biden somewhat responsible for this, because he won his election on a promise to be the moderator, the unifier. That was his whole shtick. There was the battle going on within the Democratic Party between, woke progressives and more mainstream Democratic politicians. And Biden was regarded as a mainstream guy, a deal maker. He has a history of, striking compromises in Congress and finding kind of middle way through. In fact, many of his past positions are an embarrassment for him within the party. And I think that is what many voters wanted. They wanted that kind of moderate centrist. Now, has he governed as that? I would say no, he has not. He basically has gone all in on a sort of hard left, progressive economic and political agenda. And so people feel that he broke his word, and so they don't trust him. Now, I think of course, Biden has many other issues as well, to put it mildly. People don't trust a man of his age and evidently declining faculties to do a good job. If the Democrats could find it within themselves to listen to those complaints about Biden and find a better candidate, and the party has plenty of good candidates, then I think, Trump could be beaten.
When we're talking about this, we are specifically talking about the re-election of Donald Trump. But I'm curious about what may follow after Donald Trump. Is there a concern that a door has been opened to allow similar-minded candidates a shot at national office?
I would say so, actually. I mean, that is a concern, and certainly a concern of mine. And I don't think we're taking it sufficiently seriously. But why do people suppose that if only Trump can be beaten, this problem goes away? Once trust in our core institutions collapses, and I think it might, perhaps that it hasn't collapsed, but it's seriously damaged. Once that happens, then an avenue is open for this kind of aggressive populist candidate to come through. Someone who, is going to say, forget the rules. There are no rules. These people will keep us out of office by any means necessary, and we're done with that. I mean, why should that stop at Trump? This is why the crucial thing is to restore trust, and it depresses me no end that the Democrats aren't attuned to this challenge. They have to restore trust.
Clive Crook is a Bloomberg Opinion columnist and member of the editorial board covering economics. You're listening to Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Amy Morris. Have you heard about America's impending fiscal doom? It is said to be a moment in the not-too-distant future when there will be too many elderly people for younger generations to support, and that would leave the federal government unable to fulfill its financial obligations. I want to talk about this with Bloomberg Opinion columnist and labor economist Kathryn Edwards. Okay, Kathryn, first of all, would this be a foregone conclusion? Is this a fiscal apocalypse that we can't avoid?
No, of course not. It certainly reflects a flair for the dramatic, if nothing else. But there's nothing fated about either our economic or fiscal future that policy can't change.
All right, let's talk about policy. What can the government do right now to avoid this fiscal doom?
What the government is worried about is the obligations that are going to go fund the income and the health care of the baby boomer population. And they're not wrong in that there's going to be an incredible number of elderly Americans in the near future. The youngest baby boomer is currently 59. But, I think they're a little bit focused on the old. The cost drivers of the elderly is that there's a lot of them and they live a long time. I mean, those are two things that you basically can't change. So if that's going to be expensive to the federal government, then they need to make sure that the programs that support the elderly are in tip-top shape, which means that they'd have to reform Social Security, which they haven't done since well before I was born. And then they're going to have to bolster the finances of the young. If we are going to afford an aging population, it is going to be young people that pay for it.
Let's talk about that. How can we bet on the young? How can we ensure that the young people will be able to pay for it?
Yeah, because either way they will, right? Let's say Congress passes a benefit cut to Social Security and Medicare. Who do you think is going to make up the difference? The same young workers who would be financing the program. I mean, it's young families who are going to pay for their elders no matter what. The way to make the health less expensive is to radically alter our health insurance system so that its high cost aligns with better outcomes. I mean, we're in the worst of both worlds because we have some of the worst outcomes for the highest prices, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite in policy worlds to fix healthcare or to change it in any dramatic way. And I can understand that. I mean, that's moving miles from where we are. Whereas the labor supply policy that could increase the number of workers who are young, I mean, that's moving inches, right? Let's have mandatory paid sick days. Let's have adjustments to the Fair Labor Standards Act so you're required to accommodate workers who want to work part-time, who need to have flexible arrangements a few days a week. Your tenured staff says they're going to work from home 2 days a week. You're probably increasing the number of workers by a couple million in the long run. We also need a paid family leave system. I mean, that's just kindness. If we know that there are going to be roughly 80 million people over 65, those children are going to have some hard moment where their parents are sick and they need to take care of them. And we don't really offer them a way to do so that doesn't almost always require them losing or leaving their job. There's some easy gains like sick days, accommodation policy, paid family leave. I mean, then there's some investments that we just need to make, something like paying for childcare. Something like having a decent long-term unemployment system that helps retain workers whose jobs are automated. None of these things are that radical in general. They only seem radical in the US because we're the only country that doesn't have them. But I it's all tenable. It's all possible. I think what is the true challenge is to make healthcare less expensive. And so I kind of put this as like, hey man, we can go with the easy option first. The easy option is let's work on workers. And then the healthcare fight, the healthcare debacle, whatever you want to call it, I think that one's more of the apocalypse. Nothing about aging in the workforce. We can we can afford old people. I don't think we should frame it as that. And I don't think we should spur any type of intergenerational who's getting the resources. You don't have to have that fight if you don't position the economy as a zero-sum game.
Bloomberg Opinion columnist Kathryn Edwards is a labor economist and independent policy consultant, and that does it for this week's Bloomberg Opinion. We are produced by Eric Mullo, and you can find all of these columns on the Bloomberg Terminal. We're also available as a podcast on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Stay with us. Today's top stories and global business headlines are just ahead. I'm Amy Morris. This is Bloomberg.